and welcome back. If you've been following our regular videos, you'll know that we've been dealing with travel kit photography, what to take, and some experiences along the way during our lengthy trip to Scotland. And in this final video, we're going to deal with what we've learnt and what worked and what didn't work during the trip. And I have 5 points that we will cover, or 5 lessons we've learnt, plus a bonus 6th tip that will help you in your plans and your travel photography. So let's dive in and have a look at what we've learnt. So before we get into the 5 lessons we've learnt from this travel experience, let's just quickly review what we were planning to take with us and what we suggested was the optimum travel kit. So we had a mirrorless body, we had a wide angle zoom lens, we had a medium length zoom lens and a long telephoto zoom. And looking at what we used in terms of the photographs we took, this is what we ended up with. So the 3 lenses we took, this is the number of photographs we took with each one. And you can see here that there weren't too many taken with the long telephoto. And that's largely because I expected to have more opportunities to photograph wildlife during our travels, and that just didn't eventuate. But I did use it for some things, and I still think it was a valuable thing to take. So out of our total number of photographs taken, you can see that the vast majority were taken with the medium zoom lens, and that's pretty much as expected. So the lesson from that is, if you don't have a long telephoto lens, it's not a deal breaker, but having the medium zoom and probably a wide angle lens is a real benefit depending on where you're going and what you're doing. So let's jump in now and have a look at these lessons we've learnt. So lesson number 1, obviously based on what we looked at with the usage of the lenses, depending on where you're going and what you're doing, the longer telephoto lens may or may not be of help to you. Now these are some photographs I took during the trip with the longer telephoto lens, and you can see that it's not a great photo, but we were trying to capture some wildlife. But it did become useful where we had a view over some really interesting sand and water patterns, and I was able to zoom in and capture some really lovely details that I probably wouldn't have been able to do with the shorter zoom lens. So there were certainly cases when I could use the lens, and as I said, I was hoping to get more opportunities to photograph wildlife, particularly when we went to the island of St Kilda, which was a very small island 60 kilometres off the coast of Lewis and Harris. And unfortunately, all of the bird life is actually located on these sea stacks and this smaller island that's away from the main island. And the only way to photograph those was from a small boat rocking around, and there's just no way that a longer telephoto lens could be held steady enough. These were taken with the 200mm medium zoom, and they're not fantastic photos, and it was just really difficult to try and capture anything while we were doing that. So there was opportunities there to create some photographs with the longer lens, and I'm glad I took it. It was a bit of a burden sometimes, and so it was left in the car a lot of the time. But again, depending on what you're trying to achieve, the other 2 lenses would be probably the main ones that you would need. So moving on to lesson number 2, the thing that's really hard to work out is you look at a lot of locations online, you do a lot of research, but when you get there, a lot of the locations are a lot more difficult to get to than you might have otherwise thought. This is the Old Man of Storr, which is a very popular location on the Isle of Skye. And to get to even this point where I made this photograph, it was about an hour's hard slog climbing up a very steep hill, trying to get close. And you can see the weather conditions on the day were pretty awful. We had, for the first 2 weeks of the trip, pretty much a lot of rain, showers, icy cold wind, and a lot of difficulty to try and photograph. And after climbing that hour or so just to get to that point, then looking ahead, there was this further climb to get closer to the outlook. So I decided that that this photograph was the best one, and I was happy with that. And if you look down here at the tiny little figures here, there's another track that goes up to the side, but again, these are very steep and very very tricky to get to, and when the wind's blowing and the rain's in your face, it's pretty hard going, and we didn't have an opportunity to get back there other than trying to fly my drone up there, which is another story altogether. So a lot of the places are not going to appear as you might have seen them on online photographs, and this is Glencoe. This area is so popular that pretty much all of the parking places are nearly always full, and you just have to take your chances with the weather and the conditions. As you can see, it was patchy weather, and it was also very early in April, so that the grasses and the heather were still pretty brown, so you don't get that lush green look that you might otherwise see. So the lesson from that is, depending on when you're going, the conditions are likely to be different, and some of these locations are going to be much harder to locate and get to. But I could still make some really happy, or photographs that I'm happy with, and they're just different from what you might have otherwise thought that you're going to get. So the lesson is, do your research, be prepared, but don't be disappointed if the conditions are not quite as ideal as you would hope they are going to be, and you can make the most of what you've got. Another location that's very popular, and it's not really an artistic photograph location, is a location called the Kelpies, which is a pair of statues that represent some mythical beasts from Scottish folklore. And these are quite spectacular, but it's, again, hugely popular, and you've got no chance of getting a photograph without people in them. This is just to give you an idea of scale. So if you wanted to eliminate the people and all of the messy background, you've pretty much got to then zoom in and take a photo, something like this. So at least you've got a photo, and maybe I can do something with these later on. These are only early processed items. I'll probably do something more with them later on. And the other place that I was very keen to get to was Elgol Beach on the south end of Skye, and it's a spot that's renowned for majestic photography. But what they don't tell you is that to get to this viewpoint, you've got a really hard slog across a couple of 100 metres of round pebbly beach that's really hard to walk over and very hard on the ankles, and the time of day can vary enormously. And we were lucky on this day that we had a really bright sunny day. So the photograph that I made, and again these are early processing versions, I hope to get something with a little bit more drama, but at least I've got something that shows the scale and the ruggedness of the island. So be prepared to get things a little bit differently from what you expected to get. And if you can, avoid the busy times, although on the Isle of Skye, the locals tell me that it's busy 12 months of the year. There is really no off-season now. So it's difficult then to avoid crowds no matter where you go. Moving on to lesson number 3, the importance of planning. Do your research before you go. Have a list of places that you can go to, and ideally work out the time of day that's optimum. This is back in Glencoe. The main road runs through the middle of the valley, and there are a series of walking trails everywhere, and you'll find that there are limited parking opportunities, and you've just got to hope that when you get there that there's a spot available and that the weather is not too bad. This day was very patchy, and we actually made 2 trips through the valley trying to get the optimum conditions. So prepare your list of places to go. Allow for alternatives if the weather is not good, and if possible allow to visit places more than once, because the weather may or may not suit the conditions that you want on any given day. And again, another shot of Glencoe, similar conditions can be difficult. Another place that we visited more than once was the Standing Stones on Lewis and Harris. These are about 4,000 years old and predate the pyramids, and they're in a fenced-off field that you can actually access any time of the day or night. And we visited there a couple of times trying to get the optimum light. This one I was really trying to emphasise the extent of the sky around them, and we went back on another day very early trying to avoid the crowds, because again you get busloads of tourists through here and everybody's standing around doing selfies in front of the stones. It's really hard to try and get a photograph In fact, we got here about 6 in the morning and had about half an hour of time trying to photograph before a couple of hippies turned up and decided to have a meditation session in the middle of the stones. And even with us walking around taking photographs around them, they were impervious to being moved on. So plan your trip. Allow to visit places more than once if you have the time available, because the lighting and the conditions can be vastly different. You can see here that on this early morning it was magnificent, clear, sunny morning, and we got some great photographs, and it was worthwhile going back. So again, other places. This is a place called Neast Point on the northwest corner of the Isle of Skye. And one of the things that I learned from doing my research was that the obvious thing to do would be to climb down this really steep walkway and trek all the way out to the lighthouse. But in fact, the best photographs are taken from along the cliff to the right of the car park. And unfortunately, because they'd had so much rain before we arrived there, the weather was terrible, and a lot of it was muddy and boggy. But with a little bit of care, we were able to find a spot where you could actually get a decent view of the lighthouse. This image needs a lot more work yet. It's only an early version, but again, by doing your research, you find out that you don't need to waste a lot of time and energy climbing down and walking along this very steep path, because the best shot is actually from back on the cliff face near the car park. And again, the conditions were very variable on this day. This is looking the other way from Neast Point, and the weather was quite variable. And I took this photograph. I handily had a figure in the photograph to give some scale, and literally within a second or two of me taking this photograph, we were bombarded with a hailstorm that lasted for about 5 minutes, and then the skies cleared again. So the weather, if nothing else, was changeable. And another location that was well worth visiting more than once is the Quirang on Skye, which is a magnificent area. And fortunately, you can drive up to the highest point and park. Again, the car park was pretty full most of the time, but we were lucky to have a couple of decent days, and the outlook is absolutely magnificent. We went back on a second trip just to try and get some more photographs, and we were lucky that we got some good conditions. So lesson number 3 was planning and doing your research. Knowing where to go and ideally when to go will save you a lot of disappointment with your photography. And bear in mind that some locations that you might have seen online may have been taken with a drone or taken at very extreme times of day. You may or may not be able to replicate that, but concentrate on doing your own thing. Which moves us on to lesson number 4. Don't try and replicate what others have photographed. Make your own images of where you've been. The overall guiding principle here is try and make photographs about things rather than just of things. And this is the famous Glenfinnan Viaduct out of Fort William, famous for the Harry Potter movies, and there used to be a train that ran through here, the Jacobite train, a steam engine with some beautiful carriages, and unfortunately a couple of weeks before we arrived there, the train service had been discontinued because of some safety issues. And so even though I was able to get to the ideal photographic location, the only trains we were able to photograph were the modern trains that also use this track. But again, you can see here that it's early in the season. A lot of the ground is still fairly brown. But I've made a photograph that's my photograph, not the classic one that you might have seen online. And also another location in Glencoe, the drive to Lake Ative takes you through some beautiful country and some interesting waterfalls. And again, I've seen lots of different photographs here, but my photographs are a little bit different because, again, the area was really boggy and you had to do a lot of walking around the boggy areas to try and get a location to make a photograph, but I'm quite happy with what I got. And this location is called Eilean Donan Castle. It's on the way towards Skye from Edinburgh. It's a famous castle, And the day that we arrived here, it was absolutely bucketing down rain. We arrived at the location, tried to get out of the car, and the rain was hitting us almost horizontally with wild winds. So we did the logical thing. We went to the cafe, had a warm cup of something and something to eat, and then when we came out, the skies had cleared a little bit, the rain had stopped. But the overriding impression that I had here was of a brooding, moody, medieval castle, and so this photograph's been processed to reflect that. And so again, your photographs will reflect your experiences. And again, going back to the old man of Store, I can't replicate the photographs that others have taken, but I've made my own versions of them. And finally, the church at Rodell on Lewis and Harris, on Skye, a famous church dating from the 16th century. And again, you see a lot of photographs online, but I've tried to do something a little bit different, this time using the wide-angle lens. And so moving on to our fifth lesson that we've learned from this, and that is always, always, always take a laptop with you and download your photographs as you go, because you cannot really assess your photographs from the back of the camera. Remember, you're looking at a JPEG thumbnail, not the raw file. And if you've done what I've done here, and that is collect a whole lot of garbage on my sensor, you could end up taking all of your photographs through your entire trip with these spots on the sensor. So having seen these, downloaded these at the end of the day, I was able to clean the sensor and get rid of those spots and avoid further problems. And you can also assess your exposures and focusing, and if there are any other camera issues along the way, if you download and review your photographs on a laptop as you go. And you can see here's the original photograph of one of those ones of Old Man of Store. Again, a lot of garbage on the sensor, and this happens when you change lenses and don't clean the lens or clean the sensor immediately. And with a lot of wind blowing, there's a lot of dust particles. It's almost impossible to avoid getting garbage on your sensor. But this is another version of that file that I cleaned it up, or have tried to clean it up, but it's still there. And so it can be a real annoyance. So the benefit of being able to look at your photographs, do some initial processing as you go, will hone your skills in getting the original captures. And in some cases, you're going to need to look at doing multiple captures where you've got extreme range of brightness levels. This is at Fort William. We have this old wrecked boat on the shore and a view to Ben Nevis in the background. And I handheld multiple exposures here. You can see allowed to frame the image a little wider than normal, and did 3 captures and then processed them in Lightroom to create an HDR, and then did some further processing. Now the problem is that with the HDR combination, we've got 2 versions of this figure here and 2 versions of this figure, and it's not quite ideal, but then we're able to do a little bit more work with another version, and then finally I was able to get rid of those with a little bit more processing in Photoshop. And one thing I've discovered in comparing Lightroom and Photoshop is that the remove tool in Lightroom is pretty ordinary when it comes to removing large figures, but the remove tool in Photoshop is much better, or the generative fill if you've eliminated the subjects. So being aware of the lighting conditions and the extremities of what you're dealing with will allow you to take some images. You don't need a tripod necessarily for doing an HDR. If you're able to hold the camera pretty steady, you can make those 3 images and combine them successfully. And finally, our bonus number 6 lesson: be prepared to talk to other people and learn from what their experiences are. We met a number of people on our travels, many photographers, and they were quite happy to share their ideas of where to go and what to do. And a couple of places that I had on my list that I hadn't really thought about going to, having spoken to some people, they convinced us that it was well worthwhile to go to. This is called the Fairy Pools on Skye, And even though the day was fairly ordinary again, there's some beautiful waterfalls and some very rugged country that was well worth going to. And another location on Lewis and Harris that we hadn't heard about at all is called the Golden Road, which is a very narrow little road that winds its way across the island, and it has some absolutely spectacular scenery. And one of the people we met on our travels said, just absolutely go there, it is well worth seeing. There are lots of little old rundown farmhouses and some very spectacular scenery. And this is the sort of thing you see on these little back roads. There are sheep everywhere, and they can't even be bothered getting off the road as you come along. You've really got to go and try and move them along. And that was another lesson we learnt from talking to some other people. And again, taking the opportunities when things appear before you. I knew about this location, but we had a very spectacular day where there was a very high tide. At the right time of day, we were able to capture some wonderful images here. And I even went back the next day, and it wasn't quite as nice, but it was still spectacular. So taking opportunities as they arise, even if they're not on your planned itinerary, be prepared to be flexible and stop and find the images. And we've got some wonderful images from here that will, again, after some processing, will be well worth following up. And that's the last image from our trip. And so those 6 lessons, I hope they've been useful for you, and I look forward to seeing you again soon. Thanks for watching.